A lonely veteran and his loyal German shepherd were driving under the fading autumn sun when the dog suddenly perked his ears, body freezing in place, staring sharply into the north. In the ominous silence of the mountain ridge, they felt it, the sudden, deadly drop of pressure before a brutal winter storm. Stranded miles away from any shelter, the old soldier was forced to do the unthinkable, to pull his wrecked pickup truck into a dark rock hollow and tear it apart to build a wall against the freezing death. What he had to sacrifice from his past will break your heart. But the tactical survival method he used, and the unbreakable bond he shared with a dog named Rex, might just restore your faith in miracles. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The Bitterroot Wilderness breathed a cold, dying sigh as the late autumn sun bled a pale amber across the endless expanse of whispering pines. A bitter mountain chill crept through the valleys, carrying the scent of damp earth and impending frost, while the shadows stretched long and skeletal across the lonely mountain path. The rhythmic metallic clattering of the vintage red Chevrolet C/K Silverado's engine rumbled steadily through the quiet air, a familiar, mechanical heartbeat that broke the oppressive silence of the deep forest. Inside the worn cabin, the air smelled faintly of aged vinyl, old motor oil, and the sharp, comforting scent of dried pine needles trapped in the defroster vents. John sat behind the wheel, his large, calloused hand gripping the steering column with a practiced familiarity that spoke of a lifetime spent navigating treacherous terrains. At 42 years old, John carried the quiet, heavy aura of a seasoned military veteran, a man whose spirit had been forged in fires far away from these peaceful hills and then left to cool in isolation. His face was a landscape of sharp, angular lines, defined by a strong, stubborn jaw and deep-set slate-gray eyes that remained perpetually vigilant, scanning the tree line not out of fear, but out of an ingrained tactical habit. A thick, unkempt beard, heavily peppered with silver, covered his weathered cheeks, matching the quiet dignity of a man who had long ceased caring about the superficial standards of the modern world. He wore a rugged, faded canvas jacket, a heavy garment stained with grease and wood sap that served as his armor against both the biting mountain wind and the unwanted intrusions of a society he no longer understood. The invisible scars of war and a subsequent profound grief had hardened his exterior, making him reclusive and blunt with strangers. Yet beneath that armored facade lay a fierce, unyielding protectiveness for the few sacred things he had left in this world. Whenever the temperature dropped significantly, a dull, deep ache would flare up in his left shoulder, a lingering reminder of an old shrapnel injury from his service days, forcing him to subtly shift his weight against the torn driver's seat, though his grip on the wheel never wavered. On the passenger seat beside him, completely occupying the cramped space, sat Rex, a magnificent 9-year-old German shepherd whose presence was as grounding as a mountain anchor. Rex was a large, noble creature with a thick coat of rich sable black and deep, warm tan, though a heavy frost of silver now ringed his blocky muzzle and the edges of his alert, upright ears, betraying the advanced years of his loyal life. The old dog rested his heavy chin quietly on the worn fabric of the windowsill, his deep amber eyes fixed on the passing blur of ancient pines with a calm, stoic intelligence. Rex possessed a rare, intuitive wisdom, his personality defined by an absolute quiet devotion to John, having survived the darkest nights of his master's post-war nightmares by simply placing a heavy, warm paw on John's trembling chest. A slight stiffness in Rex's right hind leg, a subtle physical reminder of a trauma sustained during a wilderness rescue years prior, made him adjust his posture occasionally, but it did nothing to diminish his majestic dignity. He remained the silent guardian of John's fractured soul. As the truck hit a small rut in the dirt road, Rex didn't flinch, merely letting out a soft, rhythmic huff of breath that fogged the glass, a gentle reminder to the lonely veteran that he was not entirely alone in the encroaching wilderness. John let go of the steering wheel with his right hand, reaching deep into the pocket of his worn-out canvas jacket to retrieve the meager earnings of his grueling day's labor. His fingers brushed against cold metal and crumpled paper, and he pulled out a small handful of silver coins and a few tightly folded bills, carefully flattening them against his thigh with his thumb. This handful of change was the sole reward for a back-breaking day spent hauling heavy, freshly cut logs down from the high ridges, an honest but low-paying job that barely kept poverty from knocking on their door. A wave of bittersweet practicality washed over his mind as he mentally calculated the exact cost of their immediate survival, prioritizing his loyal companion over his own comfort without a second thought. This sparse amount of money, won through sweat and the aching of his old military injuries, would be just enough to purchase a premium bag of high-protein dog food to keep Rex's aging joints strong, with a few dollars left over to exchange their empty propane tank for a full one to heat their drafty, isolated tent down in the valley. John's jaw tightened, with a mixture of fierce pride and quiet exhaustion. He didn't care about luxury, nor did he crave the comforts of a real house. For as long as he could keep Rex fed and provide a warm sanctuary against the coming winter freeze, his duty as a protector was fulfilled. He glanced toward the rearview mirror, his eyes passing through the dust-moted glass of the rear cabin window to look at the massive, custom-built stake bed riding proudly on the back of the old Silverado. The truck bed was a masterpiece of rustic engineering, constructed from thick, heavy planks of dark red oak that John had salvaged and shaped entirely by hand, using the intricate interlocking mortise and tenon joinery he had mastered during his years in the military engineering corps. Not a single iron nail or modern screw held the sturdy wooden structure together. It was a pure testament to old-world craftsmanship, where the strength of the wood itself relied entirely on how perfectly the pieces fit into one another. The surface of the oak was deeply weathered, marred by deep gouges, scratches, and the dark stains of spilled sap from countless loads of timber. Yet it possessed a beautiful, rich patina that seemed to glow under the fading autumn light. For John, this wooden structure was not merely a functional cargo bed or a piece of a decaying machine. It was a physical manifestation of a beautiful, lost life, with every grain of the wood carrying the phantom warmth of a time when his world was whole. As the old truck ambled further into the deepening twilight, the sight of the oak planks pulled John's mind backward into the painful, beautiful reservoir of his memories, conjuring the vivid image of his late wife, Clara. Clara had been a woman of radiant, untamed grace, passing away tragically at the young age of 30, after a swift, unforgiving illness that left John's world completely shattered and devoid of color. She had possessed a mane of cascading copper-red hair that seemed to catch and hold the fiery warmth of an autumn sunset, a striking contrast to her pale, sun-freckled skin and wide, expressive jade-green eyes that could see right through John's hardened defenses to the gentle man beneath. Clara was defined by an unyielding optimism and a playful, infectious laughter that could disarm the most severe of John's post-war night terrors. A woman who found joy in the simplest things and who loved the rustic beauty of the mountains just as much as he did. John could still see her clearly in his mind's eye, sitting gaily on the edge of that very oak truck bed during their first harvest season, her bare legs swinging over the side as she laughed at some forgotten joke, her bright red hair blowing in the crisp autumn wind while the golden leaves rained down around her. The memory was so visceral that it left an ache in his chest, a reminding sting that this battered red truck with its handmade oak bed was the final sacred cathedral preserving the last remaining fragments of the home and the love they had built together. The fleeting illusion of nostalgic peace that had cocooned the cabin vanished into the stark, unforgiving reality of the high altitude, the exact moment the vintage red Chevrolet C/K Silverado surmounted the final, exposed crest of the mountain pass. For the last few miles, the steady rhythmic hum of the old engine had served as a comforting shield against the vast, empty wilderness of the Bitterroot Range. But as the tires cleared the rocky ridge, the world outside underwent an abrupt, unsettling transformation. The thin alpine air did not merely grow colder, it seemed to suddenly thicken into a heavy, motionless vacuum that pressed against the truck's faded crimson hood with an almost physical, suffocating weight. The gentle, melancholic rustle of the lower pine valleys disappeared entirely, swallowed by an expansive, ominous silence that rolled over the barren horizon like an invisible, dark wave. It was a sudden, predatory stillness in nature, a breathless pause that carried absolutely no peace, but rather warned of a violent, cataclysmic rupture about to tear through the mountains. On the worn vinyl passenger seat, the transition from old age weariness to absolute lethal alertness happened in a fraction of a single heartbeat. Rex, whose silvered muzzle had been resting heavily on the window frame just moments before, stood bolt upright, his massive frame tensing into a rigid defensive posture that made the old truck's suspension creak softly. His large triangular ears swiveled sharply toward the frozen north, twitching violently as they captured a low-frequency vibration completely beyond the auditory range of human ears. Before his master could even utter a word of inquiry or offer a comforting pat, the veteran German shepherd dropped his center of gravity, flattening his entire heavy body onto the narrow, cramped floorboard beneath the dashboard. He tucked his broad, noble head deeply between his powerful front paws, letting out a deep, continuous, and vibrating rumble from his chest that rattled the loose metal fittings and wires beneath the old vehicle's display. John recognized that instinctive, deeply drilled defensive reflex with a sudden jolt of memory that triggered his oldest combat survival habits. It was the exact calculated maneuver from their days stationed on the remote, high-altitude border outposts, a tactical behavior Rex only executed when his heightened senses picked up the microscopic pressure shifts of incoming heavy artillery before the shells actually reached the earth. The old dog was not reacting to a passing mountain predator, nor was he merely startled by a routine alpine breeze. His internal ancestral radar was signaling an approaching atmospheric threat of total, catastrophic destruction. The dog's breath came in short, measured puffs, his eyes wide and fixed on the floor, waiting for the invisible strike he knew was coming. John turned his sharp eyes away from the dog and toward the northern horizon, his mind instantly locking into a cold, analytical focus as the remnants of his gentle memories were systematically stowed away for pure survival. Through the dust-coated windshield, the distant, jagged mountain peaks were no longer visible, having been completely swallowed by a vast, rapidly descending sheet of bruised, leaden-gray clouds. The sky had lost all its natural depth, transforming into a low, solid, and suffocating ceiling that seemed to be actively crushing the jagged wilderness below. The complete and eerie absence of wind on this exposed ridge made the steady clattering of the old engine sound unnaturally loud, echoing sharply against the sheer granite walls flanking the narrow dirt road. It was at that exact moment that a dull, familiar, and burning ache began to throb deep within the bone of John's left shoulder, the old shrapnel injury acting as an infallible biological barometer in the face of extreme climate anomalies. His extensive training in military engineering and mountain geography allowed him to calculate the atmospheric variables within a matter of seconds. The sudden, vertical drop in barometric pressure, the dead, suffocating silence, and the encroaching wall of leaden clouds meant only one thing. A massive, life-threatening bomb cyclone was rapidly tightening its icy grip directly over the mountain pass. Within a few short minutes, this exposed ridge would be violently blasted by hurricane-force winds and a blinding, suffocating wall of zero-visibility snow, turning the single narrow dirt road into a frozen graveyard. There was absolutely no room for hesitation or panic in the commander's hands, as he chose a path of calculated tactical resistance over a reckless, panicked flight down the mountain. He brought the heavy Silverado to a smooth, controlled stop on a small ledge of frozen gravel near the cliff's edge, his boot pressing firmly on the brake pedal before he immediately cut the ignition, silencing the engine to preserve every precious drop of fuel for the sub-zero temperatures that lay ahead. Reaching behind the torn fabric of the driver's seat, his calloused fingers wrapped around a thick, heavy-duty industrial-grade steel towing cable, its frozen metal links biting coldly into his unprotected palms. He threw open the heavy driver's door, stepping out into the freezing, lifeless void, where the sudden drop in temperature immediately searched for gaps in his torn-out canvas jacket. Working with methodical, rapid precision, despite the sharp stiffness flaring up in his injured shoulder, John knelt down in the icy gravel beneath the front bumper, threading the heavy steel cable through the truck's reinforced frame and securing it tightly around the solid front axle. He dragged the frozen, heavy length of metal toward a massive ancient ponderosa pine tree that stood near the cliffside, its gnarled, deep-reaching roots anchored heavily into the granite bedrock of the mountain. He wrapped the thick cable 3 times around the solid trunk, locking the heavy iron hooks into place with an interlocking engineering knot designed to withstand immense structural tension. He refused to let the coming hurricane-force winds sweep his rolling sanctuary, along with the handmade oak bed filled with Clara's lingering presence, into the yawning abyss below. Slapping the cold, solid metal of the truck's hood as a silent, solemn promise to return, John climbed back into the cabin for a brief second, pulled a heavy canvas survival pack over his broad shoulders, and unlatched the passenger door. "Rex, lead," he ordered, his voice steady, quiet, and sharp, accompanied by a clear, authoritative hand signal toward the southwest. The old German shepherd leaped from the floorboard into the freezing air, his stiff right hind leg completely forgotten, under the sudden, massive rush of adrenaline as his heavy paws found immediate purchase on the icy stones. Rex did not follow the open, dangerous line of the main dirt road. Instead, guided by an ancient primal instinct for environmental shelter, he pointed his nose toward a massive, chaotic field of black basalt cliffs in the distance. John stepped out after him, slamming the heavy truck door shut as the first jagged, icy shards of frozen sleet began to cut through the silent, dead air, marking the arrival of the monster above. The dark, imposing silhouette of Rex moved like a phantom through the rapidly darkening twilight, his massive paws navigating the jagged, icy labyrinth of the mountain slope with uncanny precision. Guided by a profound, primal instinct for environmental shelter, the noble 9-year-old German shepherd pressed forward into the freezing gale, his black and tan coat gathering a fine dusting of white sleet. John followed closely behind, his heavy boots crunching against the hardening earth, his hand occasionally reaching out to touch the slick stone walls for balance. The alpine air was now screaming with the first true gusts of the incoming bomb cyclone, a low, ominous roar that echoed through the deep canyons. Suddenly, Rex halted near a massive vertical fissure in the mountain's face, turning his amber eyes back to John with a short, authoritative huff of breath that signaled they had reached their immediate destination. The sanctuary Rex had discovered was a deep, ancient basalt hollow carved into the very bones of the Bitterroot Wilderness by centuries of glacial erosion. Stepping inside, John immediately felt a slight relief from the direct fury of the mountain wind as he measured the stone shelter with a practiced, tactical eye. The cave extended exactly 4 meters into the solid rock, offering a remarkably secure overhead ceiling composed of thick, interlocking volcanic basalt shelves. This natural overhanging stone roof protruded outward at an ideal steep angle, creating a perfect natural ramp that would allow the heavy blankets of accumulating snow to slide harmlessly off the edge rather than piling up and trapping them inside. It was an engineering marvel created by nature, a solid granite bunker that promised to withstand the immense physical weight of the approaching avalanche. However, as John stepped deeper into the rocky recess, his tactical satisfaction vanished as he discovered a fatal structural vulnerability at the shelter's entrance. The mouth of the basalt hollow was incredibly wide, stretching over 5 meters from side to side without any natural pillars or stone barriers to break the incoming wind. This massive opening was a literal death trap in the context of a high-altitude bomb cyclone, leaving the interior entirely exposed to the swirling, freezing vortex. If left unsealed, the hurricane-force winds would funnel directly into the shallow cave, transforming the natural fortress into a violent wind tunnel that would rapidly circulate the sub-zero air. In the brutal mathematics of mountain survival, an open shelter of this size was no better than standing completely exposed on the peak of the ridge. As the first freezing swirls of snow drifted into the cave, biting through his clothing, the oppressive silence inside John's mind was suddenly broken by the echoing voice of his old military mentor. The harsh, raspy cadence of his former engineering captain vibrated through his memory, bringing back the brutal, frozen nights they had survived together on the hostile northern border outposts. "The mountain doesn't attack you head-on with a blunt fist, son," the old commander's voice seemed to whisper through the howling wind outside the cave. "The winter is an expert infiltration unit. It searches relentlessly for the smallest cracks, the hidden gaps, and the unsealed corners of your defenses to slip inside and destroy you from within." That voice belonged to Captain Vance Miller, a legendary figure in the military engineering corps who had served as John's mentor during his formative years in the service. Captain Miller was a towering, heavily built man of 55, with a face that resembled a weathered block of granite, marked by deep-set, piercing ice blue eyes and a thick mustache heavily peppered with silver. His harsh, blunt personality and absolute intolerance for sloppy discipline were forged during a tragic winter campaign decades ago, where he had lost half his squad to a sudden freeze due to a poorly insulated shelter. Miller was a man who viewed survival as a strict discipline of thermal mathematics, always reminding his men that nature was an unyielding adversary that punished carelessness with death. His lessons had been carved into John's mind through hours of grueling field drills, teaching him that a soldier's best weapon against the elements was not fire, but an airtight defensive envelope. The core of Captain Miller's doctrine centered on a terrifying thermodynamic reality that John knew he was about to face within the next hour. Moving air is a thief, John, Miller had drilled into his engineers while standing over frozen blueprints in the dead of winter. Static air can be warmed by a man's pulse, but a moving current will strip the vital heat from a human body 20 times faster than still air. Looking at the wide, unprotected 5-meter mouth of the basalt cave, John realized the absolute truth of those words as the wind began to execute a cyclic draft inside the stone chamber. The air circulation would continually replace the pocket of warmth generated by his and Rex's bodies with fresh sub-zero frost, draining their core temperatures until their hearts simply ceased to beat. John walked back to the lip of the stone threshold, his slate-gray eyes peering through the gathering white veil of the storm toward the exposed ridge below. Down on the frozen gravel ledge, his vintage red Chevrolet 6/K Silverado stood entirely alone, its crimson paint looking like a solitary drop of blood against the vast, pale canvas of the mountains. The heavy steel cable he had wrapped around the ancient ponderosa pine tree held the truck firmly in place, preventing the rising gale from shaking its frame. The old vehicle looked small and vulnerable against the overwhelming majesty of the wilderness, yet it remained a stubborn monument of human engineering, refusing to yield to the pressure of the atmosphere. Standing at the dangerous boundary between the freezing wind and the stone shelter, John's military engineering mind began to systematically process the structural problem before him. He knew with absolute certainty that he could not build a literal stone fortress capable of defying the entire mountain range, nor did he have the time or tools to excavate a deeper tunnel. Survival required an adaptable solution. He did not need to stop the storm. He merely needed to completely eliminate the internal draft by creating an entirely sealed, airtight envelope within the rock. He needed a structural barrier to plug the 5-meter gap, a final protective barrier that would trap the air and force it into total immobility, rendering the stolen heat secure. His gaze shifted from the wide mouth of the cave back down to the silhouette of the Silverado, focusing specifically on the massive cargo stake bed riding on the frame. The thick, heavy planks of dark red oak, salvaged from an old valley barn and shaped by his own hands, were engineered using the precise interlocking mortise and tenon joints of his military days. Because the structure relied entirely on the perfect structural fit of the wood rather than iron nails or modern screws, the planks could be systematically disassembled without a single tool. Each oak board was exceptionally dense, heavy, and completely impervious to the wind, offering the exact structural dimensions needed to span the wide opening of the stone cavern. A sharp pang of emotional agony struck John's chest as he realized the profound personal sacrifice this tactical decision demanded of his heart. Those red oak planks were not merely functional pieces of a machine. They were a sacred hand-carved cathedral, preserving the phantom warmth and the final, precious memories of his late wife, Clara. Dismantling the truck bed meant destroying the last physical monument of the home they had built together, defacing the vehicle that had carried her laughter through so many autumns. Yet, looking down at Rex, who stood waiting patiently by his side with absolute trust in his amber eyes, John knew what he had to do to honor her true legacy. The living bond between him and this loyal dog was the most sacred thing Clara had left behind, and to save that life, he would willingly dismantle her shrine to build the fourth wall of his makeshift fortress. John stood completely paralyzed in the howling, bitter darkness of the mountain pass, the immense weight of the solid iron sledgehammer hanging like a massive leaden anchor from his rapidly stiffening fingers. The predatory wind from the approaching alpine bomb cyclone screamed through the narrow granite corridor, tearing violently at the rugged edges of his worn-out canvas jacket, but his deep-set slate-gray eyes were locked in a hollow, unblinking stare on the custom-built stake bed of the vintage red Chevrolet C/K Silverado. These very planks of dark red oak, deeply weathered by years of heavy labor and permanently stained by the harsh mountain elements, were not merely functional pieces of industrial timber. They served as a raw, living ledger recording the most agonizing, heartbreaking night of his entire existence. It was onto this exact handmade wooden structure that he had desperately laid his radiant wife Clara 5 long years ago, frantically wrapping her failing, feverish body in layers of heavy wool quilts as a sudden, unprecedented blizzard aggressively cut off their isolated cabin from the rest of civilization. He could still vividly remember the frantic, terrifying roar of the old engine as he desperately pressed the accelerator, racing blindly against time down the unyielding, completely snow-choked mountain roads, while praying out loud for a medical miracle that would never arrive. The memory became so visceral in the gathering gloom that the overwhelming howling of the present storm transformed in his ears into the tragic phantom echoes of Clara's ragged, painful breathing from that fateful night. In his mind's eye, he could still see her beautiful copper-red hair matted against her pale, sun-freckled skin, her once brilliant jade-green eyes losing their focus beneath the dim, shifting light of the dashboard cabin window as he finally pulled up to the locked doors of the closed town hospital. It was right here, on these exact interlocking oak planks of the truck bed, that she had drawn her final, shallow breath, her warm hand growing completely cold within his calloused, trembling palms before the emergency medical staff could even reach the vehicle. Dismantling this sacred truck bed with a heavy sledgehammer felt like an unforgivable act of absolute sacrilege, a violent, crushing desecration of the only remaining physical cathedral that held the echo of her last moments on this earth. Every single groove, scratch, and dark stain left in the dense wood was an indelible scar across his fractured soul, and lifting the heavy tool to strike, it felt as though he were being ordered to perform a brutal, unyielding amputation on his own beating heart. As his exhausted mind buckled under the immense, crushing weight of the sudden grief, the predatory alpine cold began to take lethal advantage of his hesitation, wrapping its icy, invisible fingers tightly around his stalling circulatory system. The dangerous, subtle physiological phenomenon known as the hypothermic sleep trap began to alter his brain chemistry, completely replacing the agonizing emotional pain with a deceptive, highly seductive sensation of absolute comforting warmth. His violent, uncontrollable shivering stopped entirely as his peripheral blood vessels dilated, sending a final, artificial rush of warmth to his numbed skin, and whispering to his exhausted consciousness that the mortal danger had completely passed. His heavy, frostbitten eyelids fluttered rhythmically, the desperate, overwhelming urge to simply sit down in the drifting snow, overriding his years of rigorous military survival training as his failing body prepared to surrender to the peaceful, quiet euphoria of freezing to death. Through the blinding white veil of the swirling, chaotic sleet, the spinning snow shapes began to warp and shift before him, coalescing into the radiant, entirely unburdened form of Clara, standing just a few feet away with her familiar, untamed grace. She looked exactly as she had during their very first autumn harvest season in the valley, her long copper hair catching the phantom, golden glow of a sunset that wasn't there, her face illuminated by a gentle, angelic smile as she reached her hand out toward him through the storm. "Come rest, John." Her soft voice seemed to drift effortlessly over the screaming gale, a quiet, melodic lullaby that promised a permanent end to his decades of absolute loneliness, brutal warfare, and unyielding psychological sorrow. John felt his rigid fingers slowly loosen their iron grip on the handle of the sledgehammer, the heavy tool slipping an inch through his palms as he prepared to step forward into the blinding white mist to rejoin her in the eternal, painless quiet. He welcomed the encroaching darkness with open arms, genuinely believing that by letting go of his stubborn grip on life, he was finally fulfilling his deepest desire to be reunited with the only soul that had ever truly understood the broken man beneath the armor. Before his heavy boots could take the final, fatal step into the yawning abyss, a fierce, heavy force slammed violently into his side, completely shattering the peaceful illusion with a brutal jolt of raw, grounded reality. Rex, instantly sensing the lethal drop in his master's consciousness and recognizing the vacant, glazed look taking over his eyes, absolutely refused to let the silent killer claim his commander without a fight. The old German shepherd lunged desperately through the deep snowdrifts, his powerful jaws locking tightly onto the thick, heavy canvas hem of John's faded jacket, bracing his large, sable frame against the hurricane-force winds as he pulled backward with a frantic, desperate strength. Rex let out a muffled, heartbreaking whine through his clenched teeth, his deep amber eyes wide with an urgent, pleading intelligence that pierced straight through the thick fog of John's fading mind, demanding that the stubborn veteran look at him. That single desperate gaze from his loyal four-legged partner acted as a profound tactical shock to John's stalling system, instantly dispelling the phantom vision of Clara and bringing the harsh glacial reality of the mountain pass rushing violently back into his chest. In the deep amber depths of the old dog's urgent eyes, John did not see fear, but a fierce, unyielding reminder of the sacred vow he had made to Clara as her spirit departed this world on this very wooden truck bed. She had held his hand with her remaining strength, whispering into the quiet cabin that he must carry her love forward into the dark, that he must protect Rex at all costs, and that he must always choose to live, no matter how heavy the burden became. To die here in the freezing snow out of emotional weakness would be a complete betrayal of her final wish, a total failure of his absolute duty to the living companion who had survived the horrors of war and the wilderness by his side. A single, hot tear rolled slowly down John's weathered cheek, freezing instantly into a hard, crystalline bead against his silver-peppered beard as he re-established his iron, unyielding grip on the heavy sledgehammer. The thick fog of hypothermia vanished from his mind, replaced by the cold, calculated clarity of a military engineer who understood exactly what structural sacrifices were required to build their defensive bunker inside the basalt hollow. He did not swing the heavy tool with blind destructive rage. Instead, his calloused hands slid into a perfect tactical stance, utilizing his entire body weight to maximize the impact while completely preserving the integrity of the timber. He aimed the massive iron head of the hammer precisely at the exposed edges of the interlocking mortise and tenon joints, the masterful woodworking connections he had crafted years ago without a single nail or screw. The first heavy blow echoed over the roaring pass like a solitary cannon shot, the intense vibration traveling up his arms and causing a sharp ache to flare in his old shrapnel-injured shoulder, but his tactical focus never wavered for a second. With surgical precision, the blunt force of the hammer struck the wooden seams, driving the tightly fitted oak teeth cleanly out of their sockets with a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks that easily defied the screaming wind. Piece by piece, the dense, heavy red oak planks slid smoothly out of their historical alignment, completely intact and undamaged, their full structural thickness perfectly preserved to serve as an impenetrable shield against the cyclone. John wiped the heavy frost from his eyes, his breath rising in thick white clouds as he prepared to carry the sacred remnants of his past to construct the final fourth wall of their makeshift fortress. The bomb cyclone detonated over the Bitterroot Ridge with a catastrophic, deafening roar, turning the frozen twilight into a chaotic white abyss of screaming wind and flying ice. The gale did not blow in steady currents. It assaulted the exposed mountain pass in concussive rhythmic pulses that mimicked the thunderous detonation of heavy artillery shells, striking a frontline trench. Sheets of jagged, razor-sharp sleet flew horizontally through the air, completely erasing the boundary between earth and sky while violently tearing at the frozen seams of John's rugged canvas jacket. Every blast of the frozen tempest felt like a physical hammer blow against his frame, an unyielding atmospheric assault designed to break his resolve. Right at that moment, as John hoisted the first massive red oak plank from the dismantled truck bed onto his right shoulder, a blinding white flare of agony erupted within his left shoulder joint. The severe, unnatural plunge in the local barometric pressure, combined with the sudden, explosive physical strain, caused his old wartime shrapnel injury to throb like a burning shard of iron trapped inside the bone. The pain radiated down his arm and up into his neck, threatening to lock his muscles entirely. Yet the veteran engineer refused to let his grip falter. Gritting his teeth against the cold sweat that froze instantly upon his skin, he focused his gaze entirely on the dark, blurry silhouette of the basalt cliffside waiting ahead. The grueling task of transporting the dense, heavy timbers across the frozen gravel ledge became a battle of pure mechanical endurance against an unyielding environment. Saturated with decades of mountain moisture and naturally hardened by time, each plank felt impossibly heavy, catching the hurricane-force winds like a stiff sail and threatening to tear John off his feet. He moved forward through the blinding whiteout by muscle memory and pure tactile instinct, his heavy leather combat boots slipping precariously on the fresh, glassy sheets of ice forming over the stones. His ragged breath rose in thick, frozen plumes of white vapor, instantly snatched away by the roaring vortex as he dragged the sacred remnants of his past toward the shelter. Upon reaching the shallow recess of the basalt cave, John's military engineering training completely overtook his physical exhaustion, allowing him to analyze the wide 5-meter opening with cold structural calculations. He instantly recalled the brutal winter survival doctrines drilled into his unit by Captain Vance Miller during those frozen, endless nights on the northern border outposts. He knew with absolute certainty that building a standard vertical wooden partition across the mouth of the cavern would be a fatal mistake. The sheer frontal force of the cyclone would simply smash through a flat surface or rip the boards cleanly out of their anchoring points. Survival in these extreme alpine conditions required an adaptable, defensive geometry that would deflect the storm's velocity rather than fighting it head-on. Utilizing his advanced understanding of load-bearing mechanics, John began systematically organizing the heavy red oak boards into an intricate, interlocking, inverted V-shaped configuration across the stone entrance. He carefully wedged the thick, hand-carved mortise and tenon edges of the outermost planks directly into the natural, jagged grooves of the solid basalt walls, creating a wide triangular arch that spanned the gap. This specific geometric alignment was calculated to act as a highly resistant, aerodynamic shield, splitting the incoming force of the hurricane-force winds and forcing the freezing air currents to slide harmlessly outward along the natural contours of the mountain. The true engineering brilliance of this frontier layout rested entirely upon its sophisticated, self-locking mechanism, a design that elegantly converted the enemy's destructive power into a stabilizing asset. In the precise physics of an inverted wedge, any immense external pressure applied directly to the apex or the face of the wooden structure naturally forced the supporting legs deeper and tighter into the unyielding stone. The harder the bomb cyclone pushed against the red oak exterior, the more securely the interlocking planks clamped themselves into the natural rock fissures, eliminating the need for modern hardware or complex fasteners. It was an unbreakable, self-sustaining seal born of absolute necessity, a tactical barrier that forced the mountain's own weight to lock their defensive envelope into place. Operating with the wordless, flawless coordination of seasoned combat veterans, Rex stepped directly into the structural workspace without requiring a single vocal command from his master. The magnificent 9-year-old German Shepherd moved with an intuitive, tactical understanding of the situation, his deep amber eyes shifting between the trembling timber and John's mechanical movements in the dim, frost-rimmed light. Having survived countless field deployments by John's side, the loyal animal immediately recognized the critical engineering sequence, understanding that the temporary, unanchored framework required immediate grounding stabilization at its core before the final locking pins could be driven home. With an absolute unyielding devotion that defined his entire life, the noble dog lunged forward, pressing the full lateral weight of his muscular, sable-coated chest and flank firmly against the shaking base of the central oak partition. Bracing his powerful paws against the uneven, ice-slick stone floor, Rex leaned his entire body heavily into the timber, acting as a living hydraulic press to pin the focal center point of the structure immovably to the ground. The sub-zero drafts whistled fiercely through the remaining unsealed gaps, dusting his thick fur with a heavy coat of white frost. But the old guardian did not flinch or shift his position by a single millimeter, keeping the structural baseline steady against the screaming vortex outside. With the critical structural center point completely immobilized by his loyal partner's immense weight, John swung his heavy tool with rapid, rhythmic precision to secure the remaining perimeters of the wall. He pulled dense, hand-carved oak wedges from his survival pack, sliding them carefully into the microscopic spaces left between the main wooden joints and the raw basalt rock faces. Using the smooth, flat side of his heavy iron hammer, he struck the wedges with measured, authoritative blows that echoed like sharp rifle cracks through the confined stone chamber, completely ignoring the fiery lines of pain flaring up in his injured shoulder. With each heavy strike, the wooden teeth bit deeper into the granite, compressing the interlocking joints until the entire 5-meter barrier became a singular, unyielding extension of the mountain itself. As the final central locking wedge was driven home with a thunderous impact, the chaotic, deafening howling of the bomb cyclone outside was suddenly transformed into a distant, completely muffled rumble. The violent freezing air circulation inside the basalt hollow died instantly, leaving behind a perfectly static, motionless air mass that felt immediately warmer as the convective theft of the winter wind was broken. John dropped his heavy tools onto the gravel, collapsing exhausted onto the cold stone floor beside Rex, and pulled the brave, shivering German shepherd tightly against his chest as the silent, draft-free sanctuary wrapped them in its life-saving embrace. Surrounded by the dense planks that carried the phantom warmth of his lost life, he closed his eyes, knowing they had successfully built an impenetrable fortress capable of surviving the absolute heart of the storm. The absolute stillness within the newly sealed basalt cavern offered a momentary sanctuary, but as the intense rush of survival adrenaline began to fade from John's exhausted system, a terrifying physical crisis immediately took hold. When he attempted to lift his heavy eyelids to assess the structural integrity of the timber barrier, a sudden blinding flash of white-hot agony erupted across his corneas. The high-velocity ice crystals, frozen dust, and relentless whiteout conditions he had just combated on the unprotected mountain pass had inflicted a severe, acute case of temporary snow blindness. It felt as though a handful of coarse, burning volcanic sand was being violently ground into his eye sockets, forcing his eyelids to swell shut tightly while producing an involuntary, freezing stream of tears. In an instant, the dim, frost-rimmed geometric lines of the stone shelter vanished, plunging the veteran combat engineer into an absolute, disorienting, and pitch-black void, where his primary source of situational awareness was completely destroyed. The psychological terror of losing his sight in the absolute center of a historic alpine bomb cyclone would have paralyzed an ordinary man with blind panic. But John's years of rigorous military discipline forced his heart to maintain a steady, calculated survival rhythm. As he sat stranded in the dark, balancing his aching body against the dense red oak planks, his finely tuned auditory senses stepped forward to interpret the shifting environment. Above the deep, muffled booming of the tempest outside, his ears isolated a faint, high-pitched, and rhythmic hissing noise echoing from the structural baseline, where the timber archway met the uneven stone floor. To an untrained civilian, it might have sounded like a harmless whisper of the wind, but to a veteran of the winter border outposts, it was the definitive acoustic signature of a critical insulation failure. It was the lethal sound of a convective draft, a series of microscopic gaps in the wood-to-stone seams where the sub-zero atmospheric vacuum was successfully slicing into their defensive envelope. John understood with cold, mathematical certainty the precise thermodynamic danger represented by that faint whistling sound. If those invisible entry points along the 5-meter entrance were left unsealed, the high-velocity external air currents would create a continuous cyclic loop inside the cave, rapidly replacing their small pocket of static warmth with fresh, razor-sharp frost. Moving air would strip the vital core temperature from their bodies 20 times faster than still air, gradually draining their physical reserves until hypothermia claimed them both in their sleep. The situation demanded an immediate, comprehensive seam seal insulation pass across the entire structural perimeter, yet John was completely incapacitated by the photokeratitis, unable to visually locate a single open fissure or identify the boundaries of the interlocking joints. He possessed the exact engineering knowledge required to save their lives, but he was entirely stripped of the sight necessary to apply the physical solution, leaving him stranded at the mercy of the dark. Sensing the sudden, drastic shift in his master's physical condition and hearing the strained, shallow pattern of his breath, Rex shifted his large frame instantly, his ancestral instincts overriding his own severe physical exhaustion. The noble 9-year-old German Shepherd stood up from the gravel, completely ignoring the sharp stiffness lingering in his right hind leg, as he closed the small distance between them in the pitch-black space. He pressed his massive warm chest firmly against John's trembling knee, lowering his blocky head to let out a soft, guttural huff of breath that served as an immediate somatic anchor for the blind veteran. With a profound, intuitive wisdom forged through years of shared combat operations, the old military working dog recognized that his commander had been neutralized of his vision and required an immediate tactical surrogate to navigate the structural battlefield. Rex did not pace around the cavern or let out a panicked bark. He stood perfectly rigid, waiting for the specific tactile cues that would allow them to function as a unified, two-headed survival mechanism. John extended his trembling, calloused right hand into the empty dark, his fingers tracing the contour of the air until they locked onto the thick, dense fur at the nape of Rex's neck, instantly establishing their old line of tactile communication. "Rex, find the wind," John whispered, his raspy voice cutting through the internal gloom of the cave, utilizing the exact verbal command and forward collar pressure they had used during midnight reconnaissance missions on the border. The veteran German Shepherd understood the directive instantly, his highly trained senses shifting entirely from standard tracking to microthermal and aerodynamic discrimination. Rex lowered his snout toward the frozen baseline of the red oak wall, his highly sensitive, wet leather nose moving systematically along the intricate mortise and tenon joints, like a specialized diagnostic heat scanner tracking a thermal leak. The old dog moved with a slow, deliberate cadence along the perimeter of the timber barrier, his large, triangular ears twitching rhythmically as his auditory and tactile senses isolated the exact coordinates of the incoming cold air streams. The moment a thin, high-pressure jet of freezing air struck his sensitive muzzle, Rex halted his movement instantly, pressing his nose tightly against the leaking wooden seam to block the flow temporarily. To communicate the precise structural location to his blind master, the loyal animal raised his powerful left front paw and scratched sharply against the dense red oak plank, creating a loud, scraping sound that echoed clearly inside the stone chamber. He held his position with absolute structural discipline, his entire frozen body serving as a living, breathing navigational beacon for the disabled veteran crawling through the darkness behind him. Guided entirely by the sharp, repetitive scratching of Rex's paw, John dragged his heavy body forward along the icy stone floor, his left shoulder throbbing with pain as his fingers searched the dark for raw materials to build an improvised insulation compound. Reaching deep into the side pockets of his worn-out canvas jacket, his hands found the coarse, dried strands of the premium hay bundle he had chattered from his early provisions, splitting the vegetation by touch to save half for the dog's eventual bedding. He then bared his hands, digging his fingers deep into the loose, clay-rich dirt and ancient volcanic ash, scattered across the deepest recesses of the basalt hollow. He scooped up a massive pile of the dense, mineral-heavy soil, transferring it into a shallow stone depression right beside the leaking timber wall where Rex was waiting. To bind the components into a cohesive structural matrix, John unlatched his insulated thermos flask by touch alone, pouring a thin, controlled stream of warm, melted snow water directly over the mound of volcanic earth. He worked the mixture aggressively with his bare palms, kneading the coarse mud and ash together until it transformed into a thick, highly malleable, and deeply adhesive mortar paste. He then systematically integrated the saved strands of dry hay into the wet clay, weaving the fibrous stalks thoroughly through the dark mud to create a reinforced natural composite. This improvised engineering paste relied on the exact same structural mechanics as ancient cob and adobe architecture, utilizing the internal fiber framework of the vegetation to provide vital tensile strength and elasticity to the earthen binder. John knew that if he attempted to use pure mud alone to seal the fissures, the extreme sub-zero temperatures outside would cause the moisture within the clay to freeze too rapidly, resulting in severe shrinkage and deep structural cracks that would instantly ruin the airtight seal. The inclusion of the dry hay stalks served as a vital internal reinforcing mesh, holding the structural matrix together and absorbing the immense thermal contraction forces as the temperature plummeted. This fibrous reinforcement ensured that when the mud paste inevitably froze solid beneath the timber, it would expand uniformly into a completely solid, airtight insulation plug that would not fracture under the intense barometric pressure of the cyclone. Moving his hands blindly across the rough oak, John followed the continuous guiding touch of Rex's snout, packing large handfuls of the thick, fibrous mud paste deeply into the microscopic cracks of the mortise and tenon joints. As the sub-zero wind outside hit the wet mortar through the gaps, the mixture flash froze almost instantly, transforming the clay into an impenetrable, concrete-like seal that completely silenced the deadly hissing sound, securing their survival in a silent, draft-free world. The immediate structural security achieved by the frozen mortar seal along the timber baseline required one final, definitive action to complete their isolation from the mountain's fury. Bracing his back against the solid rock wall, John reached through the small, remaining entry port at the lower corner of the red oak barrier and pulled Rex entirely into the shallow recess of the basalt hollow. The screaming, sub-zero gale outside howled like a wounded beast, spraying the last remnants of frozen sleet through the narrow, crawling hole they had used to transport the timber planks. Working by pure tactile instinct in the absolute darkness, John retrieved a thick, heavy rubberized oil tarp from his survival pack, folding the dense material multiple times to fit the exact dimensions of the gap. Without a single moment of hesitation, he unbuttoned his rugged canvas jacket, the grease-stained heavy garment that had served as his primary shield against the alpine winter, and stripped it off his shoulders, aggressively stuffing the layered fabrics deep into the rock fissures until the final pathway for the external atmosphere was completely choked off. The moment the heavy fabric plug was driven home, the chaotic, deafening roar of the bomb cyclone outside vanished completely, replaced instantly by the absolute, suffocating silence of an underground military bunker. The air inside the 4-meter stone cavern became perfectly static, a motionless envelope of trapped molecules that immediately ceased to circulate, causing the temperature to hold its ground against the encroaching frost. With the external world completely locked out, the interior was plunged into a profound, pitch-black darkness so absolute that it disoriented the human senses, completely erasing all physical definitions of floor, walls, and ceiling. This total sensory deprivation created an incredibly dense, oppressive atmosphere, transforming the natural granite shelter into a sealed tactical vault where the only remaining signs of existence were the metallic ticking of the cooling truck engine outside and the synchronized sound of their own respiration. This sudden, absolute confinement and the pungent, heavy smell of damp volcanic ash and trapped animal sweat immediately triggered a violent, involuntary psychological reaction deep within Rex's mind. The total lack of light and the claustrophobic nature of the sealed stone space acted as a catastrophic environmental catalyst, instantly tearing down the psychological walls, shielding the old German shepherd from his darkest memories. In a terrifying flash of post-traumatic stress disorder, the present reality of the mountain shelter was completely overwritten by a horrific memory from his younger days as a frontline military working dog on the rugged border outposts. His ancestral instincts and military conditioning dragged him back to a remote underground command bunker years ago, forced to relive the exact moment an enemy artillery shell scored a direct hit on the overhead timbers, causing the heavy beams and suffocating dirt to collapse violently over his head, burying him alive in the screaming dark. A sudden, wild panic seized the noble 9-year-old animal as the phantom ghosts of his past completely bypassed his rigorous military training and discipline. Rex stood up abruptly from the stone floor, his massive frame tensing like a coiled wire as he began thrashing violently against the narrow granite walls of the hollow, his breath coming in frantic, ragged gasps that filled the quiet chamber with pure terror. Completely blind to his master's presence, the old dog lunged desperately toward the newly constructed red oak barrier, his powerful front claws scratching and tearing frantically against the dense wood, the sharp metallic scraping sounds of his nails, ripping into the handmade planks, echoed like rapid gunfire through the pitch-black cavern as he clawed wildly at the interlocking joints, desperately trying to dig his way out of the imaginary collapsed tomb before the weight of the mountain crushed him. John did not react to the dog's violent outburst with a single spark of anger, frustration, or panic, for he understood the invisible, permanent scars of combat far too well having fought the exact same psychological demons in his own post-war nightmares. Instead of shouting useless verbal commands or attempting to physically restrain the thrashing animal by sheer force, the veteran engineer utilized the cold, calculated mindset of a sniper facing an extreme tactical emergency. He knew that in a state of hyper-arousal and traumatic flashback, the animal's cognitive processing had completely shut down under a massive rush of survival adrenaline, rendering standard training mechanisms ineffective. To break the terrifying loop of the psychological panic attack, he needed to bypass the dog's defensive armor through a direct and overwhelming input of physical grounding and biological regulation. Moving deliberately through the absolute darkness, John guided his upper body toward the chaotic sounds of the thrashing German Shepherd, entirely ignoring the sharp, burning flare of agony radiating from the shrapnel injury in his left shoulder. He deliberately threw his entire broad frame over Rex's trembling torso, using his physical body weight not to punish or harm, but to completely anchor the frantic animal to the shor's unyielding stone floor of the cave. He wrapped his powerful, calloused arms tightly around the dog's massive chest, locking his hands together right beneath Rex's ribcage to establish a firm, continuous deep tissue compression envelope. This specific tactical hold was designed to stimulate the animal's parasympathetic nervous system, providing a powerful physical boundary that signaled to the panicked body that it was no longer floating in a collapsing, weightless void. With his arms locked securely around the vibrating chest of his partner, John pressed his left ear directly against Rex's furry ribcage, listening intently to the terrifying, frantic rhythm of the dog's racing heart. He intentionally constricted his own throat slightly to deepen his vocal register, utilizing the low-frequency, steady cadence of a combat commander steadying his troops under heavy artillery fire. John began to take massive, exaggerated breaths, drawing the cold air deep into his lungs and exhaling it in loud, rhythmic patterns that vibrated directly through his chest wall into Rex's tensed body. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted out loud into the dark, intentionally lowering the frequency of each respiration cycle, forcing his own biological clock to slow down so that the dog's frantic nervous system could naturally entrain with his own calm physiology. Between the slow, authoritative counts of his breath, John lowered his lips directly to the tip of Rex's twitching, frost-rimmed ear, softly whispering the one sacred name that carried an absolute shield of emotional peace for them both. "Clara, Clara, we are safe, boy. Clara is here," he murmured repeatedly into the darkness, his voice dripping with an unyielding, profound love that pierced straight through the thick fog of the dog's wartime nightmare. That name was their ultimate shared emotional anchor, a powerful psychological talisman that carried the phantom warmth of their lost life and the beautiful autumn harvests they had shared before their world fractured. The soft, melodic sound of her name acted as a healing balm across the dog's panicked mind, reminding Rex of the sacred vow they had made to her to protect one another and always choose to live, no matter how dark the shelter became. Slowly, under the dual influence of the deep physical compression and the sacred repetition of her name, the violent tremors racking Rex's muscular frame began to subside. The frantic, erratic racing of his heart beneath John's ear gradually slowed its cadence, shifting from a terrified stampede to a measured, stable rhythm that perfectly mirrored his master's calculated breathing. The old German Shepherd stopped his desperate scratching against the red oak planks, his powerful limbs relaxing completely as his consciousness finally returned to the safe, unyielding reality of the sealed basalt hollow. He let out a long, shuddering sigh of absolute relief, his heavy head sinking onto John's outstretched arm as the terrifying phantoms of the collapsed border outpost dissolved into the motionless air of their fortress. With the psychological storm completely tamed inside the cavern, Rex curled his massive, sable-coated body tightly around John's bare, unprotected torso, fully transforming from a panicked patient into a protective, living shield. The old dog tucked his silver-rimmed muzzle beneath John's chin, his dense double coat radiating a deep, natural mammalian warmth that immediately combated the encroaching chill of the mountain rock. Lying together on the cold gravel in the absolute darkness of their bunker, the living heat of the dog's body acted as a powerful natural furnace, perfectly neutralizing the sub-zero temperatures outside the red oak barrier. Wrapped in this life-saving embrace of absolute loyalty and flesh-and-blood warmth, the lonely veteran finally let his exhausted head rest against his partner's chest, secure in the knowledge that their love had successfully built an unbreakable sanctuary in the very heart of the blizzard. The relentless progression of the sub-zero night transformed the sealed basalt hollow into a demanding testing ground for human and canine endurance. Inside the absolute pitch-black darkness of the stone vault, the passage of hours lost all conventional meaning, measured no longer by the ticking of a clock, but by the calculated rhythm of a mutual survival protocol. John knew with absolute certainty that entering this static sanctuary did not mean the ultimate danger had passed. Instead, the true battle against the silent killer of the alpine winter had just shifted inward. The lingering exhaustion pulling at his muscles from hauling the dense red oak planks was a highly seductive trap, a physiological weight urging his mind to surrender to an irreversible slumber. To counteract this lethal lethargy, the veteran engineer and his loyal partner established an unyielding tactical vigil to govern the deep darkness. Every 5 minutes, guided by a flawless biological clock sharpened by years of military border patrol drills, Rex executed his critical directive as the designated sentinel of the shelter. The magnificent 9-year-old German Shepherd would gently but firmly press his cold, wet leather nose directly against John's weathered cheek, disrupting the encroaching fog of sleep with a sudden shock of physical reality. The moment the old dog's muzzle delivered its silent, authoritative nudge, John would immediately respond by initiating a series of rigorous isometric contractions throughout his stiffening frame. He systematically flexed his frozen toes, clenched his calloused fists, and tightened his core within the cramped space, forcing his circulatory system to continuously pump oxygenated blood away from his vital organs and out to his numbed extremities. This repetitive mechanical discipline was their single line of defense against hypothermic stagnation, an unbreakable loop of mutual alertness that refused to let the cold claim a foothold in their flesh. The necessity of this relentless physiological maintenance became increasingly vital as the external forces of the bomb cyclone reached a state of pure fury on the ridge. Outside their sealed perimeter, the atmospheric monster was systematically unloading millions of tons of heavy, suffocating snow and solid ice directly onto the exposed mountain pass. The hurricane-force winds slammed into the mountain face with a continuous, terrifying roar, a sound that resonated through the thick granite walls of the cavern as a deep, low-frequency vibration that rattled the bedrock beneath their bodies. Down on the frozen ledge, the vintage red Chevrolet Silverado, securely anchored to the ancient ponderosa pine tree by heavy steel cables, stood as a lonely monument beneath the cascading white veil, rapidly becoming completely buried as the environment attempted to erase all evidence of human engineering. Yet, it was during this peak of elemental destruction that the ultimate unyielding philosophy of frontier survival began to manifest within the architecture of their makeshift fortress. The immense volume of snow accumulating against the exterior of the red oak planks, instead of crushing the wooden structure under its massive physical weight, began to undergo a profound thermodynamic transformation. In accordance with the precise principles of Arctic insulation, the rapidly piling snowdrifts stopped acting as a destructive force and instead transformed into a massive, solid outer coat. This natural phenomenon, known historically as the classic igloo effect, utilized the billions of microscopic, dead air pockets trapped within the porous structure of compacted snow crystals to create a superior thermal barrier against the sub-zero atmosphere. The heavy white blanket systematically covered every square inch of the dense oak barrier, filling the final microscopic pores and remaining micro-fissures that their improvised hay and mud composite might have missed. The furious wind, which had spent hours attempting to infiltrate the shelter and steal their vital warmth, had inadvertently delivered the very material needed to seal its own destruction. The snowdrift grew thicker and more compact with every passing minute, creating a perfectly solid, airtight insulation envelope that effectively wrapped the basalt cave in a protective, self-sustaining thermal cocoon. The enemy's own immense power had been structurally hijacked by the inverted V-shaped geometry of the planks, forced to serve as an impenetrable shield that locked the freezing core of the storm completely outside the perimeter. Inside the deep stone recess, the immediate physical consequence of this environmental sealing was nothing short of miraculous for the two battered survivors. The violent, chaotic drafts that had characterized the early stages of the cyclone died out completely, leaving behind an absolute motionless mass of static air that held its ground within the rock walls. Without the convective thief of the winter wind to constantly strip away their energy, the ambient temperature inside the tiny bunker began to slowly but steadily stabilize, trapped within the non-conductive boundary of the basalt. The living mammalian heat radiating from Rex's dense double coat and John's broad torso was no longer wasted, instead reflecting off the smooth stone ceiling and warming the immediate microclimate of their sanctuary. Lying completely motionless in the pitch-black void, his left shoulder throbbing with a dull, manageable ache, John listened intently to the steady, rhythmic respiration of the loyal dog curled against his chest. The soft, mechanical rise and fall of Rex's ribs, accompanied by the deep warmth of his fur, filled the silent chamber with a profound sense of peace that defied the chaos raging just inches away on the cliffside. In this quiet moment of absolute isolation, a soft, weary smile spread across the veteran's weathered face, his mind flashing back to the grueling engineering lectures delivered by Captain Vance years ago. He remembered the old captain's harsh, unyielding voice explaining that a true engineer does not waste energy attempting to match the raw brute force of nature, but instead seeks the elegant geometry required to redirect that power against itself. The deep realization of their triumph washed over John with the absolute clarity of a commander who had successfully navigated an impossible ambush. He understood now that in the eternal conflict against a hostile environment, the survivor is never the one who attempts to push back the storm with sheer arrogance or physical strength, for the mountain possesses an infinite supply of violence that will eventually break any rigid wall. True survival required an adaptable, calculating discipline, the wisdom to recognize that the most lethal weapon the enemy possesses can be systematically disassembled, reframed, and used as the ultimate foundation for protection. By sacrificing the sacred remnants of his truck bed to build the fourth wall, he had not destroyed Clara's memory. He had allowed her legacy of protective love to materialize as a physical barrier that forced the deadly winter to preserve their lives. As the deep night wore on, the terrifying howling of the bomb cyclone outside was reduced to a faint, harmless murmur, entirely separated from their static world by the thick thermal envelope of snow and wood. Rex delivered another gentle, routine nudge against his cheek, but this time, the gesture carried a sense of shared victory, rather than desperate urgency, their biological tempos perfectly synchronized in the dark. John tightened his arm around the brave German shepherd, pulling the heavy sable body closer to ensure that not a single calorie of their shared warmth would be lost to the stone. Enclosed within the heart of the storm, shielded by the very ice that sought to destroy them, the old soldier finally allowed his mind to rest, secure in the absolute certainty that they had successfully turned the mountain's wrath into an unbreakable sanctuary of life. The pale, icy shards of a fragile alpine dawn finally pierced through the dense, suffocating vault of compacted snow that had buried the entrance of the basalt cavern. Inside the absolute darkness of the shelter, the motionless envelope of static air remained warm, preserved perfectly by the thick, defensive cocoon of ice that the bomb cyclone had inadvertently constructed over their red oak barrier. As the heavy, apocalyptic roaring of the mountain winds subsided into a distant, harmless whisper, John slowly re-established contact with his physical surroundings, his swollen, frost-bitten eyelids fluttering open to reveal a blurry, dim landscape. The excruciating pain of his temporary snow blindness had gradually softened into a dull ache, allowing his slate-gray eyes to adjust to the faint silver light, filtering through the microscopic gaps of the frozen mud mortar. Beside him, Rex delivered a final, routine nudge against his palm, his silver-rimmed muzzle completely free of frost, his breath steady and calm. Reaching into the shadows, John's calloused fingers wrapped around the heavy, cold steel blade of a broken-handled military entrenching shovel that he had salvaged from his survival gear. Working with a slow, calculated mechanical rhythm, To conserve his remaining physical energy, the veteran engineer began aggressively digging a vertical extraction shaft upward through the massive, heavy snowdrift, blocking their escape route, while Rex used his powerful paws to clear the loosened ice fragments from behind. Breaking through the final crust of the frozen avalanche, John emerged into the blinding, pristine white desert of the mountain pass, pulling the noble 9-year-old German shepherd up into the freezing, crystal-clear morning air. Standing on the high ridge, John turned his gaze down toward the gravel ledge, where his rolling sanctuary had been securely anchored to the gnarled roots of the ancient ponderosa pine tree. A sharp pang of sorrow struck his chest as he witnessed the sheer, devastating force of the mountain's wrath. The vintage red Chevrolet C/K Silverado was completely flattened, its crimson steel body twisted and crushed into a ruined, crumpled cage under the titanic weight of the cascading snowdrifts. Yet, as his engineering eyes shifted back to the mouth of the basalt cavern, a profound sense of triumph washed over him. The inverted V-shaped configuration of the heavy red oak planks remained completely intact, unyielding and unbroken, its sophisticated self-locking geometry having successfully diverted the entire frontal pressure of the cyclone to preserve their lives. 12 months dissolved smoothly into the changing seasons of the Bitterroot Valley, transforming the extraordinary tale of John's miraculous survival and his absolute unyielding devotion into a legendary narrative that spread like wildfire through the remote logging towns and mountain communities. This incredible account of human endurance and canine loyalty eventually caught the attention of Mr. Thomas, the legendary master craftsman and elderly proprietor of the largest timber and carpentry workshop in the entire region. Intrigued by the iron will of the veteran combat engineer, Thomas decided to personally travel up the valley to seek out the lonely soldier. Thomas was a towering, large-boned man of 72, carrying a powerful frame that was now heavily bowed by the agonizing progression of severe arthritis and old age, causing his movements to be slow but deliberate. His face was a rugged landscape of deep-set lines, weathered by decades of flying wood chips, alpine frost, and the dry heat of massive timber kilns, framed by a thick, square-jawed countenance and a magnificent, untamed beard that cascaded down his chest like a waterfall of silver and iron-gray wool. His piercing hazel eyes, heavily hooded by bushy white brows, reflected an absolute, uncompromising honesty and a total intolerance for superficial pleasantries. Decades ago, Thomas's only son and natural heir had been tragically lost in a massive logging accident deep in the northern wilderness, a catastrophic event that had permanently hardened his exterior shell against the world, leaving him as a blunt, stern patriarch who spoke with a deep, raspy resonance. Yet, beneath this armor of hardened granite lay a quiet, profound fountain of human empathy, and as he looked into John's eyes, he recognized the silent discipline, the surgical precision, and the unbroken integrity of a fellow builder who understood how to navigate the cold. Realizing that his own failing physical strength would soon prevent him from lifting the heavy adze and governing the massive timber empire, Thomas offered to hand over absolute ownership and management of the entire carpentry workshop to John under one sacred, non-negotiable condition. The old master demanded that John must continuously keep the fires of the Grand Forge and drying kilns burning brightly, and he must actively shelter, protect, and provide a fair livelihood for the ragged, forgotten laborers and broken souls of the valley. Recognizing the profound nobility of the request, John looked at the elderly craftsman and solemnly agreed, accepting the tools of the trade as a new tactical mission. John intentionally chose a life of permanent celibacy, refusing to ever let another soul replace the sacred, untamed image of Clara that remained permanently etched within his heart. But he opened his arms wide to the world. He systematically transformed the massive facility into a renowned community haven named Warrior's Rest Stop, turning the carpentry shop into a thriving sanctuary specifically designed to provide meaningful employment, technical retraining, and communal housing for discharged combat veterans suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and for the desperately poor families of the mountain range. In the exact center of the workshop's grand main hall, right before a massive roaring stone hearth, where a brilliant fire burned red and continuous through the shifting winter seasons, sat a colossal long dining table. This monumental piece of furniture had been hand-assembled by John himself, constructed entirely from the exact same heavy, red oak planks that had formed the life-saving fourth wall of their basalt bunker on the frozen pass 1 year ago. John deliberately refused to sand away the physical history of the timber. The deep, jagged scars left by his heavy sledgehammer blows, the rough notches of the mortise and tenon joints, and the dark petrified streaks of the improvised volcanic mud and hay insulation paste were preserved perfectly intact beneath a thick, clear, protective glaze. Every single evening, as the bitter winter shadows lengthened over the valley, the old soldiers, the ragged woodworkers, and the vulnerable souls would gather tightly around the massive oak table, sharing large, steaming bowls of hot soup, while their faces were illuminated by the dancing amber glow of the hearth fire. Within this safe, draft-free environment, they found the courage to openly share their deeply buried stories of battlefield trauma, personal loss, and gradual redemption, healing the fractures of their minds through the warmth of a unified community. Resting peacefully beneath the massive wooden framework of the table, directly at the feet of his master, lay old Rex, whose magnificent sable-coated body had now reached 10 years of age. The relentless passage of time had heavily silvered his broad muzzle and left his deep amber eyes permanently clouded by the dim, soft veil of old-age cataracts, stripping away most of his sight. Yet, his large triangular ears remained held perfectly erect and alert, swiveling rhythmically to capture the comforting cadence of human laughter and the crackling of the logs, sleeping in absolute peace as the quiet, living guardian over the miraculous rebirth of a community that was successfully warmed and bound together by the very cracks that had been healed in their shared past. The journey of John and Rex from the freezing isolation of the Bitterroot Pass to the roaring warmth of the warrior's rest stop stands as a timeless testament to the unyielding power of resilient love and communal healing. The fourth wall, once a painful monument of a tragic loss, was successfully transformed not into a tomb, but into a heavy oak table where broken souls could safely rest and rebuild their fractured lives. In the grand ledger of existence, true survival is never about standing alone against the overwhelming fury of the storm, but about expanding one's heart to shelter others from the cold. Through the silent, sacred bond between a lonely veteran and his devoted German shepherd, a fractured past was systematically woven into a magnificent tapestry of hope, purpose, and mutual redemption. Their story reminds us that no matter how severe the winter of our sorrow may become, the warmth of human empathy and unconditional loyalty can always bridge the deepest chasms, turning the absolute harshest wilderness into a vibrant, enduring sanctuary of life. It is within these shared spaces of compassion that the human spirit truly triumphs, proving that every broken seam in our lives can be beautifully sealed with love. Dear friends, the miraculous survival of John and Rex reminds us that even in the absolute darkest freezing blizzards of our lives, we are never truly alone. God works his greatest miracles not always by sweeping the storm away, but by giving us the strength, the silent loyalty of a devoted companion, and the love within our hearts to withstand it. He places pillars of hope in our lives exactly when we need them most. In your daily walk, whenever you face an unyielding trial, a heavy burden, or a cold valley of sorrow, remember that a beautiful rebirth is waiting just beyond the snow. You possess the divine power to turn your deepest scars into a sanctuary of warmth for someone else in need, bridging the gaps in your community with kindness.
Tell us where you're watching from and what part of this journey stayed with you. Subscribe for more stories about restoration and faith. And wherever you are, may God bless your home, guide your step, and bring life back into the place that once felt forgotten.